there would not be left a single Arab man, woman, or child in the lands of the Romans, except that they would be killed or exiled and banished from their lands. This tragedy that befalls the Jews and befalls the Christians, Muhammad and the family, Muhammad said that it is something that will happen to the Muslims in the time of the Mahdi as well, or in the time that's preceding the rise of the Mahdi alayhi salam. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Alayhi al-Mahdina wa sallim taslima. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear sister and companion, Yasmin.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Aba Al Sadiq.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me here. It's an honor, Aba Al Sadiq.
The honor is all mine. God bless you.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about an important topic. We're going to give our viewers a tool to predict and see into the future, a key, so to speak. And this was a key from the keys of the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, who was one of the most well-known prophets in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and who had one of the mightiest kingdoms of all time that is not rivaled to anybody except for the kingdom of the Qa'im. And this key from Solomon alayhi salam is found, there's a reference to it that's found. It's actually preserved in the Old Testament, in the book of Ecclesiastes, which he authored. It preserved his sayings in that book. He says in there, whatever has been will be again. Whatever has been done shall be done again. There's nothing new underneath the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new. It was already here long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. In these verses, in these words of the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, are great secrets that can be unlocked. And it is the baseline or the foundation of a future episode which we're going to make, in which we will discuss the idea of the technologies that were available on the earth, that existed, that were similar to or more advanced than or rivaled the technologies that we have today, that was utilized by other creatures and ancient peoples that lived on the earth before us. Okay, but we'll get into that later. The idea that we want to focus on today is this idea that time, as the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam has stated, is not linear. It is cyclical. And so the events that take place on the earth, right, happen in these rounds. The past repeats itself in the present, and the present repeats itself in the future. And for that reason, we are able to find these archetypes that exist throughout history in the story of mankind and the stories of the prophets and the messengers. And finding and identifying these events and these archetypes and these characters will help us identify and know what it is that's going to happen in the future. Okay? And you have a lot of that exists. So you have, for example, in Judaism, and in Islam, you have this story from the time of Moses. And in the story of Moses, basically, you have the mother of Moses, and she has a dream from God. She's inspired by God that she has to save her child because the Pharaoh at that time had received news from his astrologers, his astronomers that were reading into the stars, right? Mm-hmm. He would ask them for advice about his kingdom. He would rely on these individuals to tell him kind of, or give him insight into the future. And so one of the insights that they gave him was that his empire, the Pharaoh's empire, the Egyptian empire, all of Egypt was going to be threatened by the birth of a Hebrew. And so out of a fit of rage, right, and fear, he decides to issue a decree in which all of the Hebrew males or babies that were born during that time period were to be killed, right? Yes. And when we look at this event, this story of this Pharaoh who's existing, who gets news from his astrologers that a savior baby is going to be born, and then he goes on a rampage and he decides that he wants to slaughter or kill all of the children that are alive at that time, we find that particular event repeating itself. It's a repetition of something that happened in the past, and it's something that repeats itself in the future, because we have in the narrations almost the same story being told about the birth of Abraham. You have Nimrod, you have the evil tyrant of Babylon who's existing at the time. It says in the narrations that he was relying on his astrologers to identify for him any threats that were posing dangers to his empire or his kingship. And they tell him, lo and behold, there will be a child that's born because they saw a star in the sky or a meteor in the sky. And they warn him. And he, out of fear, decides that he's going to kill all of the babies that are alive at that time. And the narrations, Jewish and Muslim, speak about how Abraham's mother and his father had to go and hide him. And the mother took him, and she actually gives birth in a cave somewhere. And she safeguards him and hides him away from all of society, lest the people or Nimrod find out that Abraham or the Savior King was born. And so that is almost an exact identical story to the story of Moses, yet it happens beforehand in the time of Abraham. Now, one can look at that and say that, okay, maybe the story of Moses is a fake one, and the authors of the story of Moses are copying the story of Abraham that came before. Or you can look to the words of Solomon and use the key which he gave us and come to realize that no, it is because history is cyclical and the events take place in the same fashion or in similar fashion as they did before, and there's nothing new underneath the sun, and those who want to know the future must study the past. And then you find the exact same story repeating itself once again in the future, in the time of Jesus, where you have this king of the Jews who's a tyrannical king, and he gets word that there is a child that's going to be born, the Messiah, and he's going to pose a threat or a danger to his rulership. And so he decides to issue a decree to kill all of the babies that are alive at that time. And so the same thing that happens to Moses and to Abraham happens to Jesus, and his parents have to go out and give birth to him and hide and migrate from the land and go out to Egypt in order that they preserve the life of Jesus until that king dies and then his successor comes. And so we find the story of Moses repeating itself in the past with Abraham and in the future with Jesus. And that is not the only archetype that takes place. So we have now here this event, right, of a tyrannical king repeating itself. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Herod. And so you find that the theme of a tyrannical king who's trying to preserve his empire is there and repeating itself. And we find the sending of a savior is also there, and it's repeating itself. And he's posing a danger to the rulership, to the system of rule that's existing at that time, right? Through Abraham, through Moses, through Jesus. And when you look into the stories closer, you'll find that it's is really repeating itself in all ways, shapes, and forms. You find a story that exists about a woman who's in the household of Pharaoh, who is supposed to be the wife of Pharaoh. In some cases, the narrations state that it's the daughter of Pharaoh, but you have the daughter of Pharaoh or the wife of Pharaoh, and she is a believer in Moses. She's sympathetic to the plight of the Hebrews and to the Savior that is born, and she wants to remove harm away from them. And she pleads with her husband, the Pharaoh Ramses II, that he should bring no harm down upon Moses and his people. And in the end, she ends up being persecuted, according to the narrations, by Ramses, and in some instances or some versions of the narrations, she's killed by being impaled or dropped from a high station or a high tower down onto spikes that penetrate her body. And we find this woman being identified in Islamic narrations as having the name of Asya, alayhi salam. And she is mentioned to be one of the best women that ever exist, or one of the 4 best women in history. The character or the archetype of Asya, this woman who is married to a disbeliever, who pleads for the case of the believers or the Savior, repeats itself in the time of Jesus, in the story of Claudia Procula, the wife of Pontius Pilate. It's like the story repeats itself almost identical, word for word, verbatim. You have Pontius Pilate, and he's being pushed to persecute the Savior by the Jewish people. And his wife is having these dreams about this man, Jesus. And she is sympathetic with him. And she's saying that he is a man from God. And so she believes in Jesus being somebody who's holy, somebody who's a messenger from the Creator above. And she pleads the case with Pontius Pilate, urging him not to bring down any harm upon Jesus. And so that story is the exact copy of the story of Asya. And yet, once again, we find the exact same story repeating itself in Islam. So you have the story in Judaism and with Moses, and now in Christianity with Jesus, and you find the same story repeating itself in Islam, in the story of Karbala with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, when he confronted the tyrant Yazid, and the revolution of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam poses a threat to the kingship or the rulership or the authority or the kingdom of the evil tyrant Yazid who's ruling unjustly. Imam al-Hussein is the savior of Islam. He's coming forward, and in the very household of Yazid, there is the wife of Yazid, Hind, who is sympathetic with Imam al-Hussein and with the case of the believers, and she's pleading their case, urging the husband Yazid, lanatullah alayh, to not take action against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And so you have the same character of Asya appearing once again in the time of Jesus and appearing once again in the time of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Is it the same soul, the same individual? No, it's not a reincarnation of the same soul or the same individual. And certainly Moses was not reincarnated as Jesus and then later reincarnated as Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. But it's these events, the archetypes, the circumstances continue to repeat themselves time after time in history. And I think that is an incredibly interesting point that is confirmed in other narrations from Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. For example, in Al-Hafta Sharif and a group of Gnostic narrations and conversations that took place between Imam Al Sadiq alayhi salam and Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar, and conversations that took place between Jabir al-Jafi and Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, you'll find that there is this theme where they are asking the Imam about the Adam of our time. Was there anybody that existed before him? And they confirm and they say that before our Adam, there was an Adam and an Adam and an Adam and an Adam, and that we're the seventh, that we're the people with the seventh Adam or with the eighth Adam. Our Adam currently, and that we know, was the seventh or the eighth. And the narrations also pointed out to Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar, Imam Al Sadiq points out to him that if you examine the Holy Quran, you'll find that the conversations that are taking place between Moses and Pharaoh are, that instance is repeating itself throughout different surahs. So you'll have the same scene appearing in multiple surahs, but in different ways. At one time, Moses will go over to Pharaoh and he'll say to him, for example, can I lead you to the truth? In another surah, he'll go up to Pharaoh and he'll demand from him to let my people go. And yet in the third surah, he'll approach Pharaoh, and the conversation that's preserved in the Quran between the two of them is yet in a different way. And so Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar is told by Imam Al Sadiq alayhi salam that the reason before this is because each conversation between Moses and between the Pharaoh was referring to a particular time period. So each conversation was a time period where there was a Moses figure who went to his Pharaoh at that time and told him to let my people go. And then history repeats itself again, and a new Moses is sent to a Pharaoh and he demands of him to let my people go, but the conversation is in a different way. So every time that the conversation is listed, it is a different cycle of history where a different Moses is sent to Pharaoh. And another narration states that the cycles repeat themselves, and that just like we have a seventh Adam or an eighth Adam, we also have in every cycle a Jesus, a Noah, a Pharaoh, a Haman, a Abraham, a Nimrod, and a Muhammad and the family of Muhammad that are sent to every time. Some narrations indicate that the Abraham or the Adam or the Moses that was sent is different than the one that is sent in our day and age. And there are other narrations yet that state that the Muhammad and the family of Muhammad that are sent to the first Adam's generation or cycle are the same that go to every single generation or cycle after that.
SubhanAllah, that's incredible to hear this. This is such a fascinating information that I myself never heard of. And when you explain it that way, it makes sense, because why would the same scene repeat itself multiple times, but the conversation is different?
Exactly. So I think that that's interesting. And it also is important because we have to examine these events and then know what it is that we must expect at the time of the Qa'im or the time of the Mahdi. And I think that it's interesting that we have in the time of Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, them stating that just as they had this war at the beginning of Islam between these two families, the family of Muhammad and the family of Abu Sufyan, they predicted and stated that that war would repeat itself in the end time between the character of the Mahdi or this promised individual from the family of Muhammad and between this character that's called the Sufyani that will appear in that time, who would be a descendant from the family of Abu Sufyan. And so the story at the beginning of Islam repeats itself once again in the time of the end of Islam. And you also have these narrations that speak about things that will happen in the time of the Mahdi that seem eerily similar to that which has happened in the past, in our recent past, and also in the past in the times of the prophets and the messengers. For example, you have these reoccurring instances throughout the history of Judaism where the Jews are oppressed by, or the Israelites are oppressed by a tyrant who comes through and who exiles the Jews and spreads them all across the earth, like the Assyrians did or the Babylonians did when Nebuchadnezzar came in and he imprisoned a bunch of the Jews and he placed them in essentially concentration camps or put them as slaves to work in his empire, and the rest of them he exiled throughout the lands after destroying the home of the Jews. You find the same thing repeating itself in Christianity. You have the tyrant, not Nebuchadnezzar, but this time Nero, and his successors who are continuously for several hundred years before Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. You find them persecuting the Christians. You find them taking them and using them as candles in the streets of Rome. You find them dropping them or dipping them down into burning oil or burning water, and you find them crucifying and performing all kinds of horrendous torments and acts of murder on the Christian population that was existing at that time and exiling them from Rome. And you find that the narrations of Muhammad and the family of Muhammad speak of this idea that in the time, one narration that was mentioned by one of the companions that was alive at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was speaking about the signs that he was given or events that were going to take place in the future in the time of the Mahdi. And he said that one of the things that would happen is that there would not be left a single Arab man, woman, or child in the lands of the Romans, except that they would be killed or exiled and banished from their lands. And so this tragedy that befalls the Jews and befalls the Christians, Muhammad and the family of Muhammad said that it is something that will happen to the Muslims in the time of the Mahdi as well, or in the time that's preceding the rise of the Mahdi alayhi salam. And it's also reminiscent of the actions that have taken place in the world wars that we or mankind has recently just experienced, whereby every time there is a world war, especially in World War II, you had the events that took place where the Jews and other minorities were sent into concentration camps. The Japanese were held in concentration camps in America, while the Jews were held in concentration camps across Germany and in the German regions that they were occupying. You find that the same kind of environment is repeating itself now. There, it was a time where there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic sentiment that was existing. Today, we have a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiment, anti-immigrant racism against immigrants. And you have a big problem that Europe is facing, and that is what they deem to be the invasion of their lands by immigrant Muslim populations, mainly of Syrian, Afghani, and Iraqi descent, basically, when they all migrated to Europe and America as a result of the wars that have taken place in their countries. And you find that there are these events that are repeating themselves, just like there was an event in the time of Nero, and buildings were burnt and he was blaming it on the Jews. You find that there are buildings that have been destroyed in the West, in the United States, terror attacks that have happened, 9/11 that's happened, that also has been blamed on Islam as a religion and the Muslims as a people in general. And there are these rising tensions that exist between the two populations, and you find the populations that are existing in Europe and America in this very time, they have gone completely to the right. And you find the president of America, which is modern day Rome, and that is built upon Roman ideals. And you find the West in general, which is the modern day Rome, and even the European Union uses as a symbol of its flag the stars and the colors that they use on all of the portraits that's behind Mother Mary in the Catholic Church to represent the 12 disciples and, Christianity. You find these Roman empires repeating itself, repeating again, or the circumstances that is existing in the Roman empires, paralleling and being a repetition of those environments that existed in the times of the persecutions against the Jews and against the Christians, and that history is repeating itself. And we find the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ confirming that and saying in the narration that they would all be expelled or killed, that there's going to be a time where the Muslims that are living in the West will no longer be welcome. And you have Donald Trump now, who's the leader of the United States of America, getting ready to go into office. He's already nominating individuals to hold positions within his government and in his cabinet. One of those individuals he's stirring a lot of controversy on social media and in the news because he was pictured without a shirt on, and he has on there several crosses that are tattooed on his chest, and they're basically not normal crosses, but crusader crosses. And it just goes to show that the crusaders who once were are now returning. The war against Islam that once was is now returning. The Holocaust against the Jews is now returning. The exile and disbursement and oppression and the murder of the population or the ummah or the nation of the final prophet sallallahu alaihi is about to happen in the same way as it did before with the Christians and the Jews. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi said that you will follow in the same footsteps as the Christians and the Jews, so much so that if they were to go into the lizard hole, you would fall in the same direction.
Yeah, and we find also in the narrations of Ahlul Bayt that you've mentioned before that it's said, the narrations of Ahlul Bayt has said that what happened, the sunnah of the prophets, previous prophets and messengers will repeat in the time of the Qa'im.
Absolutely. And so we'll stop right there and we'll leave that for our viewers to think about and to be careful about and to be warned about. And I will mention that Imam Ahmed al-Hassan, he did himself also speak about the times that we're living in many, many years ago. And he told us, and I know that you were one of those people that I told about the words of what the Imam had said. And he said that the far right would come into power in Europe and in the West. And there would be many attacks against Muslims, and that it would be done initially in a very hidden way, a way where these governments would be paying Nazis and far-right extremists to and pushing them to conduct attacks against Muslims and against Arabs. And in the apparent, they would condemn these acts, but in reality, they were the ones that were funding it or behind it and pushing it. And it was all to lead up to a war that is inevitable, that will take place between the countries in the world. God bless you, kid. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll speak again.
Thank you so much, Aba Al Sadiq.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.